Okay, welcome back, everybody. I guess let's continue. I don't have anything else to intro here. Giving a lecture. So, this is where we were. So we're designing URLs, not accepting default ugly URLs. So again, like there's this situation, right, where we need to refer to a row right, in a database. That's really what's happening here. That I have, I guess in my example here, I have like blog posts or something, right? And I need to refer to which record in the posts table in the database are we talking about, so that when somebody visits a URL, we can look up that row in the database and display the blog post. And join the foreign key and get all the comments that go with that blog post or whatever. So I want this, right? So the unique and URL safe are relatively easy if I choose the primary key. I want something more meaningful. So the slug, like the thing that usually happens for one of these is you find some string that is probably unique. Maybe not always, but probably. And you turn it into a URL safe version of itself. So that, it's a pretty easy string transform. It's something like all lowercase, remove punctuation, turn spaces into dashes, right? It looks like is probably what's happened between this and that. Okay, so that's now URL safe. I need that field to be indexed in the database so I can look it up in, log-ish time. And then I can use it in the URL, right? So which post? This one. And then I look up by that string. As long as it's indexed, it's really not different than the primary key. I can get to it really quickly, find out that it's not there very quickly, and then carry on. So I replaced a primary key lookup, take this string, convert it to an integer, find the primary key. Instead, I'm looking up by this indexed field. I have to store it, so I can index it, but pretty low cost and a much more beautiful URL as a result. So after all of that, right? So if this example I had before of like, I have like code organization and a verb that I don't care about and an implementation technology that doesn't belong in the URL and a thing that refers to a database row that is not human meaningful. And I can turn it into something like that, right? So first name space last name run through this slugify transform is usually unique. And if I can look that up in the database, this is a really nice URL. This is a URL that I can get behind. And that if it appears in Google and I see it, I don't know, what are we going to get here? So again, like they have like wiki is sort of taking up space there, right? So there's a reason to not have that path component that's meaningless or unnecessary, I guess. If that appears in the search results, it's very clear, like, okay, so this site's idea of this person, that's what I'm going to get if I click that URL. It's nice and human readable and beautiful, and it's the kind of URL I want my site to have. So I guess I said like usually unique, right? So usually first name, last name is unique. Within well, I guess within a what, right? Within humanity, no. Within people at SFU, usually within people in a class. I don't think I've ever had two students with the same first and last name in a class. It's certainly a very rare occurrence, but it could happen. So the usual thing that's going to happen there is some kind of disambiguation, probably -2, -3, -4. It means that deciding on this slug is now a little bit trickier, right? So it's take the string that you think is usually unique, transform it into something that's URL safe, start a transaction. Is there anything with that slug in the database already? If there is, well, try -2. Is that there? Yeah, try -3, try -4 until you get to one that's actually yours and is unique. I guess you can then sort of say, well, oh, how unique do I have to be? Do I have to be unique globally, which is what's kind of implied by this URL path? Do I have to be unique within the year? Do I have to be unique within the month? You get to make that choice, and hopefully you understand your content well enough to say, well, this is, if I somehow subcategorize my records, I'm more likely to be unique. I'll have a more beautiful URL. Or maybe I just want this in the URL. It's nice to say that this is a March 2021 story in my blog or post in my blog, and that this is the kind of content it has. This is one, I mean, speaking of the newspaper industry, God, local newspaper websites are just a bane of my existence, right? You find some story on Reddit or whatever, it's like, oh, a thing happened. What thing happened? Where is this? What city are you in? I don't know where the Times news thing is, like whatever. I don't know where that newspaper is from. When is this story from? Like date and city would be really useful things to know about a news story. And if you can shove data in the URL, then hey, at least that's something. So again, I've definitely seen websites where, is this like WordPress does this maybe? Like I've seen apps where the user is expected to generate this string, and like if it's not unique, they get a validation error on the form, and they're like, no, somebody has already used that identifier. You have to pick a different one. I think this should be automatic. And again, like this process that I've been talking about, the usually unique thing, and then enforce the uniqueness as you're building your database record. Even better, let somebody else do it. So like in Django, so again, this concept of slugs, and certainly the term slug came from the Django community. So it's a little more developed there, where, so like there's this, it's not part of Django, it's a third-party package, but you can pip install it easy enough. And you just end up saying this, right? So this is basically the story I've been telling. If you replace this with blog post or whatever, you have something called title, because you know your data, you know it's usually unique. And then just say, oh yeah, create me a slug from title. And there's an annoying, there is an annoying default here. I think you have to say unique equals true. I think this is, you actually have to say populate from title, comma, unique equals true on this. I don't think their first example is actually correct. Or you can say populate from this function, it has to be unique within. So the implication here is that my URL is something like author name / publication month / this field. That's great. Again, it will then, it basically will have that while loop written for you that is keep looking for one that's unique within the right things. It will generate a database index, right? So there should be a unique key on these fields, like this field plus this field, which you again can look up with. It takes care of all that for you, which is nice, good, and great. Code that is obvious and I don't have to write. Cool. This is an annoyance. Because again, I was telling the story all the way through here with English text in my mind. So there's the slugify function is the thing that sort of lives within Django and is expected to do this transform. Okay, so these two strings have a collision when you run them through this function, but again, you would hope that because of whatever other tool you're using, it would get disambiguated somehow. Okay, so that's great for English text, right? So if you have non-English text, that's not a great result there. Because again, the logic here is basically strip, like keep, letters turn to lowercase, keep letters, keep the spaces, and nothing else is, I think, the logic that's probably hidden in that function. So the exclamation marks get stripped, that's good. The non-English characters get stripped, that's less good. so if you kind of use this thing blindly, you can have a bit of a mess. And just unfriendly URLs. So this is, I mean, fundamentally bad, right? Like, one, Huanying will not fit in URL. It's not, these are not URL legal characters. A few slides back, there's that example. The Unidecode library, I think the Ruby one is the original, this is a thing that's obviously wrong. Like, everything about this library screams, this is incorrect. What it does is it takes arbitrary Unicode as input, returns ASCII that is kind of phonetically equivalent. And this is obviously impossible and obviously an error-prone process. But the idea is, you take this and you say, well, what's the phonetic of that? Huanying, sure. Now, some of the bright among you might be thinking, well, yeah, but my family's Cantonese. That is not how you pronounce those characters, even if they were written in traditional. And this is why this is obviously, like, there is no way to solve this problem well. Well, there is. This isn't it. What this is a probably good enough way to solve this problem, right? So I take this string, I turn it into this, and then I turn that into a URL-friendly slug. That's not bad, though, right? So if I'm telling this story back here, and I'm like writing a blog post, and I have, you know, this situation where the title gets turned into a string that has to be unique and appears in the URL, if I write a blog post with this as a title and that ends up in the URL, I think that's kind of delightfully good. It's unexpected in a good way. That's not what I would certainly expect as a user, but hey. And again, so the same thing. I mean, my Russian is pretty weak, but I gather from Google Translate that this means welcome. And I gather from Unidecode that this is at least similar to, you know, a reasonable phonetic transcription of that, of those characters. Is it the way you know, a native speaker would turn these characters into English text? I don't know, but hey, it's probably not bad. And as automated things go, great, right? For one line of code or one function call, that's pretty nice. And if you do this in, what can I show you anything? Actually, sorry. No, wait, the discussion forum doesn't do that. Anyway, slugs in courses. Wow, I'm just trying to think of a link. If I can click on a link here that would not show private information that I'm not allowed to record during a lecture, probably not. Anyway, there's something called like exercise 1 in courses, right? Assignment 1, final exam, like those strings that I give as a title for an assignment or whatever, they get run through basically this. So if somebody does come along and give an assignment with like, you know, Cyrillic characters in it, it will get sort of phonetically transcribed into something that is safe in the URL, and then it will be part of the URL for that assignment. I don't know if anybody does that in courses, but it would happen. All right. So, I mean, I've been talking about URLs here. I'm aware, by the way, that like talking about URLs for an hour and change is not normal. Like, most people don't think URLs are as interesting as me, but I think they're important. And I do think they're something that web developers should give more thought to than they actually do. Maybe I can affect the world a little bit on that. Moving on to another way to use the web and to use URLs. And the reason that I think this belongs in the same lecture with URLs is the URLs become sort of a backbone for an API here. And okay, if you don't know what an API is, we'll come to that. And if you don't know what REST is an acronym. These are things I hate. REST is an acronym that's meaningful if you already understand what it means, right? So if somebody comes along and they say, hey, I heard about this thing called REST. What is it? And you say, oh, It's representational state transfer. You have not explained anything to that poor person. But that is what REST stands for. Let's see if we can figure out what these words mean, then understand what REST is. Okay, so the goal here, the fundamental goal of REST is to create an API, which is basically it's a machine consumable way to access functionality from your site. So instead of a user coming along, users come along and they look at a web page as HTML and they read it, in a web browser. This is, well, the same website, the same web server, probably the same database, but in a way that an Android app can access, or in a way that some automated tool that is going to work with that data can access, or whatever else. We're going to use HTTP for it. Didn't have to be. There's other ways to construct an API that will function over the internet, but we're going to go with HTTP. And one of the things I like about REST is I am not there's no new technology from here on out. The lecture here is basically, well, we already know what HTTP is. We already know URLs and response codes, all those things that build HTTP. We already have everything we need. We're just going to think about it as if we're constructing an API, and it turns out everything is going to just fall together. So it's not like REST is a thing you download, right? There's no package to install. There are packages that help you do REST-like things, but there's no it's not like there's a fixed this URL must do this. Effectively, this is a set of guidelines, for better or worse. It might mean that you have, some of you might have experience using REST or doing REST-like things and will be unfamiliar, or the things that I'm about to say will be a little bit different. That's part of it. I guess, you could go read Roy Fielding's PhD thesis, which is where this came from, for some definitive, but effectively it's just, this is what people do. This works, and people like REST APIs, and well, this is what they mean by that. Mostly, usually, asterisk, citation needed. Okay, we already know this, or we learned this today. URLs identify resources, right? So there's some content. The example I'm going to build here while I'm talking about REST is a contact manager, like you've been doing in, what assignment is that? 8-ish? So a resource, again, is something like my contacts, or one of my contacts, or something like that. Content. And they're identified by these URLs. They were when we were just talking about the web as it appeared in a browser, and that's still true when we're talking about REST. This was true when we were just talking about URLs in the web browser. The representation was often here's some HTML, here's a JPEG image, or whatever. Okay, we might choose a different representation in this context, but the fact is still true. It's still doing the same thing. And I guess the thing that I didn't really mention before was internet media types. So that is, do I have, yeah, this kind of thing. If I request a URL, it's this bit, right? So the content type, this is the internet media type. So what's being communicated here is from Google to my web browser is I'm going to send you some content. The way you should interpret this content is as HTML. It's not plain text. It's not a JPEG image. It's not a PDF document or whatever. It is. Do I have to log out of Google now? I do. I have to log out of Google, so that cookie is no longer useful. Oh, no, wait, that's a set cookie. Right, curl does not know my Google login. Okay, no problem. Good. So yeah, there's this string that effectively identifies the file format. Okay, so that's representation. Okay, we have one letter, well, two actually. A representational is this. It's content is represented with file formats and media types. The transfer is things are going to move around by HTTP. So we already have these HTTP methods. Well, I guess the ones we've talked about really are get and post, where it's basically a read and then a sort of can have side effects, modification sort of operation. We'll throw a couple more HTTP methods in there I'll talk about in a second. Put and delete. Delete is a fairly obvious. What put and post mean, I think, is less obvious here. And then state in this context is, data is stored. The thing that you're going to put in the database or the files on disk, right? So the server is keeping track of like, who are my contacts? Like, what are all the phone numbers I know or email addresses I know or whatever? So that information that's being stored is the state. The server is going to be sort of in charge of that. So there is state, it's being stored by the server. It's going to be transferred between the server and the client, both read and write, right? So the client is going to be able to modify, like add a new contact kind of thing, transfer that contact from the client to the server. And then we're going to represent it with various file formats. Representational state transfer. Again, if you already know what the acronym means, REST is a very good acronym, but it doesn't have very much explanatory power if you don't. Okay, so, well, the URLs that we had before are still URLs. We can still sort of think of them the same way. We just think, well, maybe it's a computer talking to me, not a web browser and a person. So this, microformats.org link. Right, so they have, well, maybe I'll just leave that open. I'll come back as I go. So the same kind of thinking that went into creating URLs before, human facing, well, we can still do that, right? So I have all the contacts that my site knows about. I have this user's contacts, and I'll have a URL for those. They're separate pieces of content. Or I guess the way I phrase this here, it's all the contacts that for the logged in user, and then this one person's contact information, I guess should be consistent with my slides. And the operations that we definitely need are the CRUD operations, create, retrieve, update, and delete, which is basically like, well, create, read, change, remove. Well, I have 4 verbs that I need. I have 4 HTTP methods that I've talked about. And there are, by the way, 2 things happening here. Here's all of the contacts. So like a thing that is like conceptually a list and a thing that is conceptually a single record. So we have like individual records and collections of records. And we're going to treat those differently because, well, they're different. Okay, so in not the original order, but a GET request is going to map onto a read or retrieve operation, and it's going to be just get the thing. So I imagine there's some way in my file format to represent a collection, a list of things, and of course the record itself. So I get one record, or I get a list of many records, or collection, or iterable, or whatever I'm talking about here. A put HTTP request maps onto an update operation, and it's update the single item. So again, this is like one contact or the collection of all of the contacts for the logged in user. So update that one contact. Like, okay, well, there was a phone number and an email and a middle name and whatever else. Here's the new record for that person. Or this is a really big operation, right? Like, here's my entire address book. Please replace the old address book with the new address book. So, well, conceptually, that's okay. Maybe it's a little bit dangerous, and I would like to think a little more carefully about implementing that. But conceptually, that's what we're going to do there. A post operation is going to map to create. So I guess this one's a little more obvious, right? I have the collection of all contacts for this user. A post request is going to be, here's a new one. So you used to have 10 contacts in your address book, add an 11th one. So if we're adding within a single record, maybe this is something like add a new phone number for this person, or add a new email address for this contact. And and then delete means delete, and it means delete. That one I think is reasonably obvious. So again, I haven't, like, it feels somewhat strange to give this lecture. I haven't done anything, right? So I didn't, like, URLs already existed, HTTP methods already existed, the concept of like representations of data already existed. We're just going to now think about a computer, like a code making the request instead of a person at a web browser. So again, like for this contact manager or whatever example, well, so again, I have all of the contacts, this one person's contact information. So if I put, well, what does put mean? It means update. So I might choose to represent a contact as a vCard. I don't know if people still use vCard, but it, you know, it exists for sure. It is a, what is it? Virtual contact file. All right. There's probably an example in here. Come on, Wikipedia. I'll donate later, Jimmy. Jeez. Really no example? Burned me, Wikipedia. All right. Anyway, this is a format designed for this. Like, if you have your, I don't know, collection of Google contacts or whatever, I bet you can export that as a vCard, or export one of them as a vCard. That's a kind of, again, name and phone number and address and email address is what this thing is designed for. So maybe I have, again, a program that is an API consumer that is capable of producing a vCard, whatever that is. And then I can put to this URL to replace, because that's what it says over here, right? So if I put, it's replace this item with this information as provided. Or, I mean, I guess the thing I didn't mention here, I can get this URL and get back some representation. Now I have a question, right? So a computer might want this, or it might want JSON or XML or something, but a web browser wants HTML. How do I decide which one to send the user? But if we stay with the write operations and we just imagine that there's computer programs doing the work here, post is add. So maybe this is, here's a vCard with only an email address. So I post to this URL with this very simple thing, and it's a add new sort of subrecords, add new phone numbers or addresses or whatever. So like I said, for the GET request, we have a choice. And it's, if a web browser comes along, I probably want to represent the information as HTML. If an API consumer comes along, again, the app or some other piece of code, well, maybe they want this more machine readable representation, or they want a JSON, or they want whatever else. Well, it turns out we had a thing for that already, and it was this accept header that we already knew, right? We already talked about the accept header. I talked about it in the context of a web browser, and I said, well, for like an image tag, some web browsers can understand a WebP image and some can't. So web browsers might send an accept image/WebP header saying, oh yeah, if you have this image format, send it. If not, you know, if the web browser doesn't send that, the server can send a JPEG representation. So the web server, sorry, has always been able to make that, or at least technically we've had the ability to make that decision. We probably didn't use it. We probably only had one image format, but we could have. Now we can make the choice in our own code, or in, you know, with a REST framework or whatever. It says, well, have a look at the accept header. Did the accept header come in a way that kind of looks like a web browser that wants HTML? Okay, well then send them HTML. Did it come in saying like, I would like JSON, or I would like vCard, or I would like whatever else? Well, send them that. Easy. Again, we didn't have to invent anything for this to work. If we're thinking about a collection URL, and I think by convention, probably the collection URL ends with a slash. That seems to be, you know, kind of emergent behavior among people who do this. Again, not a rule, but it seems to be what people do. Well, what did we say back here? A put request should replace the collection. So, okay. Put is, yeah, replace the contact list, replace that whole collection. Or post request is create, add a new contact. Or get, either get the whole collection as a web page or a web browser, or as a vCard representation for an address book app, or JSON representation for somebody else, or whatever it is. Maybe we add a fifth verb here. There's a patch method that can take, again, that totally replace the collection operation is a very severe big operation. Maybe just update some of the records in the collection is a more reasonable bit of behavior to expose. Sorry, so if I come back to this REST URLs here, and again, the reason that I think about this in the same lecture as URLs is, well, a lot of this is about URL design, right? So I have this URL for collection of things and a URL for a single thing within it. This site, I mean, they're using something that I imagine is a database primary key, not a meaningful slug, but hey, I'll get over it. That's fine. I have this URL, and the HTTP verb describes what I want to do to that record. This is one, again, just for technical reasons. There's places where it's kind of difficult to send anything other than get or post. Those mostly have disappeared. I think, in JavaScript in the browser can certainly produce a delete request. An app certainly can produce a delete request, but you'll often see this thing implemented where it's like, well, if a post request comes in with this little hack on the end, we'll treat it like this because it was hard to generate a post request from that client or that user agent. So, and well, we have these same kinds of relationships that are in the path hierarchy. Well, they were in the path hierarchy before, they're in the path hierarchy now. We haven't really changed our URLs, we've just changed how do we think about them. Or we've augmented the way we think about them, maybe. What is, oh, right. This is, I mean, if you want more of this, this is, edging up towards book length, a very long blog post describing these things. The word idempotence is one that I feel like should be described more. And it is not a common word. That is true, whoever the author is. So idempotent in the computer science context is doing the thing more than once has the same effect as doing it once. Did I say that in this? What course was it I was saying this? Maybe it was this course. I don't remember anymore. This is like an elevator button is idempotent. You can press it once, you can stand there and press it 1,000 times. It has exactly the same result. So what's important here is that a put request, which is the update thing, is idempotent, right? So update to this, update to this, update to this. As long as you're sending the same data every time, it's the same effect. A post request is not. So the post request is create, add additional information. So if you say post, 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 you've added 3 records, not just 1. So that distinction is important in this context. That puts should be idempotent, posts should not be. So that file format question, I guess, is maybe a little more complex than people often give it credit for. Because honestly, I think the decision that most people make most of the time, mostly when they're creating APIs, is that my representation is a JSON string. It doesn't have to be, right? So again, there are all these other formats for various kinds of data that are perfectly good and often very useful for interoperability, where you will have other systems that are capable of producing this format, not the specifically weird JSON thing that you've decided is useful for your application, but JSON is probably a good default. And right, like I said before, back here when describing like this interaction, well, my web browser is sending that anyway, right? So there was already a request header that was, I guess I'm not logged in, so there's no cookies to worry about. There was already a request header that said, hey, I'm willing to accept text/HTML. Like that was already there, and it's always been there in every request you've made with a web browser. So in this story that I've told, we didn't really change anything. We're just now looking at that header that we were kind of ignoring before and maybe doing something a little more advanced for non-web browser user agents. So again, all of this, that whole story I just told for the last like half hour, I didn't like, nothing really got added. I guess we have a few more HTTP verbs than before, but HTTP always was capable of being an API sort of substrate, not just web browsers and JavaScript and users. We just have to look at it properly. And this is one of the things I really do like about REST. It's this like delightfully simple. It's not even an invention. It was already there. Roy Fielding just had to come along and say, why don't we use it as an API, guys? That would be pretty good, right? Again, I think the story that I told here is that the same URLs will do both things. That this URL will, if I type it into a web browser, I put it here, whoops. If I put it here, it will be the like collection of all of that person's phone numbers, or an API can hit that same URL and modify. That's technically true or technically possible. It's often not technically, often not just practically easy. It's probably easier to have a separate collection of URLs for your API than for users to hit, because it's just not the same use case, really. I have to tell a very simple story to make both of those things behave exactly the same way, and all the ways you would use them. You get the same thing, like every time that sort of CRUD operations come up, there's this like, well, what about the other operations? Like create, retrieve, update, and delete are great things. Those are definitely things I need to be able to do to my data, but they're not the only things I need to do to data. Where, again, I think this is a canonical example of like, okay, what I don't want to do, if I'm going to take money from this bank account and put it into that bank account, I don't want to issue an update operation to remove money from that bank account and then another update operation to put money in that bank account. That needs to be done as a single transaction because, well, remember databases? That. And then what about the arguments, right? So I have these other things that I have to do. And maybe this is, well, no, because I'm not creating one. I'm creating two monetary transactions here, right? It's this account is receiving money, this account is losing money. I have to make sure those things happen as a single operation. So there's this, like, I do like this REST API design rulebook. It's not new, if we're honest. It has been around a few years, but it is a nice, pretty light, pretty easy to look at description of how to design a REST API. They suggest something like this, which is, okay, well, on this account, or probably from this account, I'm going to transfer money, and then we'll have some arguments, maybe a query string or maybe something else that describes, how much money and to where. These other operations that are maybe not clear, or maybe it's the contents. The data that I'm posting is some JSON representation of how much money and to what account. The other thing that is not new, but where we can now look at a little bit differently, are these status codes. So again, I told the story about HTTP status codes, I don't know, 5-6 weeks ago or whatever. And I said, oh, you do the thing and you click the URL and the web browser gets a 200 OK, and here's the data. And I skipped over some of them because if you're thinking about a server and a web browser, well, maybe created doesn't make a lot of sense, but back here it does, right? So if I'm about to do or if the request is a post operation to an REST API URL, well, this is now a completely sensible response. That you asked to create something, this is now effectively return success kind of operation. It's effectively a like return value from a function that is like, okay, you asked to create this, here's the URL that identifies it in the future, right? Create the object and return it. In this context, it's probably a how do you spell this guy? Whatever, right? So it would take this form of like the API consumer, whatever program is calling this, can send the post request, and it gets back this and it says, okay, it's there. And now I know if I do want to modify it later, I know how to refer to that object that just got created. Or let's see, do we have anything else in the 200 range? Not really. But then the things in the 400 range, especially, really start to look like, so again, where these are like return values that, okay, well, the function has succeeded, here's its result. The 400 series start to look like it failed, here's the exception or description of the exception that was thrown. Effectively, where, I mean, any API we're effectively calling functions over the internet, I guess we need those two concepts, just like we do with functions in a programming language. So, okay, method not allowed is now irrelevant, right? So this is if we're an API, if somebody tries to do a delete on a record that we have just decided deleting is not allowed, okay, well, you can return a 4 or 5 method not allowed. That's very descriptive. Or I want to update a record and here's some XML data. Well, I don't know what to do with that data is perfectly, again, perfectly reasonable way to communicate back, like here's what's gone wrong. So a lot of these things, again, especially the 400s, are much more understandable, I guess, in this context than they are between a web browser and a server. Sure. Right. So this is why I have slides, because I completely forgot about this. Right, authentication. So again, if we're telling the story and we have like the contact manager or whatever, I want to be able to modify my contacts. I don't want you to be able to modify my contacts. So we need authentication and authorization checking happening. When it's a website, a username password pair is a totally reasonable thing to ask for, right? The user is going to get redirected to a login page, type the username and password, and come back. That's not the way to authenticate across an API because, yeah, username and password isn't the thing to do here. OAuth is. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds of how OAuth works. I think I do want this one diagram that's somewhere down here. So this is, again, this is an app. So you can think of this as an app on a phone or a program that the user has run on their computer or whatever it is. So this back and forth, and I'm sure you've done this. Well, actually, you've done this thing with like, I guess sorry, it's not OAuth. I was thinking of the SFU Zoom login. It's not an OAuth, I don't think. Anyway, anytime you've logged in with your phone and you've been kind of bounced to a login page and come back again, this is what's going on there, and it's the app says, hey, I'm going to send a user over, and then user sees a username and password. They type it in once. So the server knows their username and password and checks it against their database with some hashing and whatever. The app never sees the username and password, or certainly never sees the password. And then the response, or the sort of redirect back to the app, is, hey, we just logged in somebody. Here's a sort of unique code that refers to that authentication that just happened. And then there's a little back and forth of like, who is it? Oh, they're the user with the GG Baker, and that they have whatever other properties we're going to tell you about them. Then you can start making requests. So there's this, again, a bunch of cryptography happening here. It's like, here's this crypto token that is unique, and the only way for me to have that token is because the user logged in and said yes. And then, okay, well, send me their contact or update this contact or whatever. The server can always decide to not honor that if it's not allowed. But well, it is complicated. Like, I always feel like there's like one too many back and forths on the OAuth conversation whenever I have to look at it. But I'm sure there's a good reason, and I'm sure the people that implemented OAuth knew what they were doing. If you want to sort of communicate with an API or have an API that others communicate with, you need the authentication. This is probably the way to do it, OAuth 2, and off you go. It means finding a library and implementing it and whatever else. And then in your code, and again, this is something where, like last week, I was complaining about the tutorial that just ignores the details, right? So the front-end framework tutorial that just ignores the fact that a backend has to exist, or the Docker tutorial that just ignores the fact that a computer has to run the Docker containers and you have to configure the computer to do that, or the REST tutorial that just completely ignores the fact that you have authentication and authorization checks. So the authorization checks, again, they're these things that probably end up going into your code one way or another. This is probably not how they're going to happen. Conceptually, this is what we need, right? So we have some URL endpoint that refers to a contact, and it's identified by something that came out of the URL. If a GET request comes in, we do a GET sort of thing. If a POST request comes in, we do a CREATE sort of thing. We could write that code. It's boring code. Like this check of like, does the request have this as one of its preferred types in the accept header, is not exciting code to write. Figuring out the representation, not exciting. But you've fundamentally written code like this, right? So somebody has requested the page, here's some HTML, like you've probably done that as part of your exercises or project or whatever. In some ways, we're just adding a little bit more complexity, but probably we're not going to write that by hand. Probably there's going to be some framework that's going to help us. Rails is a little bit more like in a standard distribution, a little bit more friendly to REST. The Django REST framework is big and does all the things, and I'll do a little demo here. So again, the thing that I don't like very often you can do one of these framework tutorials. It's like, oh yeah, we have this REST framework. All you have to do is, okay, well, you install it. That's fair. Okay, then you have some URLs, and the URLs map onto, this kind of URL maps onto this kind of whatever. And hey, look, you have an API. It's just that easy, says the tutorial. And then there's all these questions like, again, what if I want the user to be able to see some of those objects but not others, and it depends which user is logged in. Which fields are they allowed to see? Do I want it to be JSON? Do I want it to be vcard or XML or something else? How do I say that? It's like, how do I say that the user who is logged in is only allowed to see records that are owned by them? I bet that's not in the tutorial, right? Like, oh, see, I have to get to tutorial part 4 before authentication and permissions are something that I'm told about. It's not bad. Like, I know people, writing a tutorial, you have to pick, right? You have to do something first. I understand that, but This is complex. And it's something I said, I probably when in the security lecture, I said, look, like there's all these frameworks that say, oh yeah, we'll help you do authorization. It's like, well, how much? Like there's arbitrary complexity in the authorization rules that you're going to have on a site. So I have a demo. Let's close some garbage tabs here. Okay. So this is my exercise 8 implementation. Like the one that I provided to you is written in Django because that was just the easiest thing for me to do. What do I need here? I need that, let's say. Okay, and let's crank up the old development server and get started here. So this is a thing that you saw. Wait, as I have it. Right. So okay, great. There's this stuff happening, and whatever. Apparently, I broke my thing, but how did that happen? Oh, it's a version of that library. I'm willing to let that go. Whatever, because I don't really care about the user-facing front end. I care about the Django REST framework code that I am going to, let's discover here. So I basically went through, again, like I basically went through the Django REST framework tutorial, and I said, okay, well, what if? Like, what if you had exercise 8.5 that was do this, like have an API to go with your contact manager? What would it be? Like, what would I have to do that? So I have created the Django REST framework router, the thing that maps URLs to functionality. And I've said, okay, well, there's a thing called contacts. Like this URL is going to map onto this object, whatever that is, and it's going to be at the API path or the URL path API. So if I go to /API I get this. So this is a page generated by the Django REST framework. So this is free, right? This is something that I guess, you know what, if I had hit this URL with just in general, or with a header that was application.json, I get back a JSON representation of whatever the heck's going on here. Like I made a GET request, I got a 200 OK response. The content is JSON, and that's the thing. When I made the same request in a web browser with accept text/HTML, I got this page, right? So it's doing that, like managing the accept header and figuring it out for me. And basically showing me this like developer friendly version of the content. So, okay, so I said in my URLs.py, like the contacts URL is going to map on to contact view set. Where does that live? It lives here. Yeah. I'm a good programmer. I know what I'm doing. Okay, so maybe I'm going to do this, right? So this is probably what the tutorial says to do first, right? It's that this object, whatever it is, thing about viewing model objects in the REST API that I call this, it's about contact objects. So when somebody comes along, I bet that this is what's in the tutorial, that I set the query set to everything from that table, or all of the instances of that model object. And then how am I going to turn one of those objects into data? Well, I'm going to do it with this thing, which let's start with that. Did I do something wrong? No, just impatient. Okay. So again, this is, I bet, what you would get out of the tutorial, right? So this kind of thing. So what's happening here is, did I? Yeah, okay. So there's a foreign key here of like which user owns this contact. So what I've done right away, because I did the default thing, or the thing that I saw in the tutorial, was the records that are being retrieved. So even if I do something like this, which is the user has to be authenticated before they can view this page. So I know they are logged in, but I haven't done anything with that information. Like no matter what, I've retrieved all of the records from that table, and I've just said, okay, here you go. That's not what I want, right? So I don't want, so the currently logged in user has ID 1. They should not see this record, right? So right away, I have an authorization checking problem. Okay, so I dig in the tutorial, and what I'd had there before was this. And okay, by the way, like this is something that I think you should be able to do this, right? Like I'm pretty sure the tutorial implies that you can just say, well, which model object? It's this one. But then that doesn't work. Like it took me forever. It genuinely took me a good little while to understand what this meant and what I was supposed to do about it. I do remember going through that, and eventually I found out this, like set the query set to some query set that returns the right class. That's how I say what my model object is, or something else, because I didn't do everything perfectly. But what I really want to do here is, instead of just, so this is like a query set that always returns nothing, but it returns a list of the right kinds of nothing, which is enough for the Django REST framework to kind of understand what I meant. But then when an actual request comes in, so I know I know they're authenticated. So I know that there is a user, and of course I had to figure out, like, how do I, I'm given self as an argument. How do I figure out who the user is and look up appropriately? And it took me a while to figure this out. And then, so the actual records that I want to reveal to this user is this set. The thing where you should be allowed to see it. And my application rules are, if you own it, you can see it, and that's it. This could be, of course, arbitrarily complex. Okay, so now I have this. I've got just the records owned by me. Great. Yep. Okay, so I've done that one. Again, like these are sort of notable additions on top of what I would imagine, I saw in that first tutorial on this framework. Okay, so the other thing that I wanted to do here is I want to add a separate calculated thing. Which is full name. So I know I have like first name and last name here, but I want to have like first name space last name as a thing that is just returned by my API. Why? Because I've just decided I need that. And so, okay, I dove into the documentation a little bit deeper, or, I probably did something like that, and yeah, I probably found some page like this. It's not purple, so maybe it wasn't like exactly this page, but oh god, it's the same example though. That you can have. That's not the right way to do that. Yeah, this is. Anyway, that I have a field that is read only, and it's generated by a method, right? So I have a field called full name. I have a method called get that. And it returns the string. So that creates this field in my result. And of course, like now I can do arbitrary calculations here to generate one of these, even if that thing is not explicitly in the database. Or like maybe I don't want to expose those fields to the user, first name and last name separate. I just want name. Maybe that's just a better way for my data to be represented, better way for it to be shown to the user for whatever reason. So I could do that. I'll keep things the way I had it there. yeah, so it took me a while, right? It took me a little while to figure out what that was. And that, so again, serializer here is about how do I turn data, the model object, the actual contact object that came out of my database through my object relational mapper, how do I turn that into data that can be serialized into JSON objects or whatever else I'm sending, XML or something. And that's what this serializer class is about. And, oh, right. So I can, like at this point, I can make a post request. So the question now is, well, what if I do this? Like this is a perfectly legal request. I am trying to create a contact and I'm trying to set owner ID to 2. It's actually not, wait, that's not the exception I expected. Did I? Maybe owner ID is a read only. Anyway, it threw an exception. I certainly don't want it to throw an exception. Like no reasonable data that I give should throw an exception. So at least that's bad. What I really don't want to happen is I don't want, maybe I did my demo in the wrong order. Wait, let me see. Yeah, okay, so that's, okay. So the thing is it wasn't in the query set, or it would not be returned by the query set, so things failed. So what I've allowed here is I've allowed user 1 to create a record for user 2 because I followed the tutorial and I didn't pay attention. Okay, so wait, let me, sorry. Sorry, the demo with the undo button is delicate. Okay, I think I'm good. So what I need to do here is make sure when a record gets created, and again, how do I sort of inject my logic into the record creation process? Well, let's see. It's a view set that's in control of this. So, I look through the documentation and I say, somewhere down here, I managed to find, but I'm not in a generic view set, I'm in a model view set. It took me a good little while to sort of descend back through these mixins and find out that, oh, there's a perform create method. It takes a serializer, which is one of these deals. And okay, so I'm just going to manually update the field. And I'm not actually sure if this is the correct Django REST framework way to do this. I am going to inject into the data that has come from the user, whatever the owner ID is, I'm going to make sure it's them. It's not an owner ID that you told me. It's an owner ID that is you, the person who is logged in. I'm going to enforce that record be set to that value. Then I'm going to call this superclass method. So now, well, frankly, no matter what I put here, if I put anything, if I put nothing, if I put 1,000 there, it will be set to the currently logged in user's foreign key, which is what I want. Okay, so it's a few lines of code, but I will say, like when I use the Django REST framework, whenever I've had to do it, very much wonderful and horrible is the experience I've had. Everything is there. Everything is possible with 3 lines of code. What are those 3 lines of code? Good luck. It's in here somewhere. Like, how do I work with this, create model mix-in? How do I modify its behavior in just the right way, so that, oh geez. Yeah, but see, I didn't override the create. I overrode perform create. Was I supposed to override .create? I don't know. I did this. It does what I want. How did I find it? I don't remember anymore. And it could just be that this is the most recent time I have had to do this is with the REST framework. You will be going through stuff like this. Like if you haven't worked with Express, Rails, Django, or whatever, you're going through this with that framework now, or again, I have gone through it most recently with this because I don't use it very much, and I had to deeply uncover, like, I knew I had to do this. How do I do it? What is the 3 lines of code that make that possible, and let me express this logic in my application? It can be really hard to figure out with these frameworks, and like, this framework is complex, right? So requests come in, responses come out, but oh boy, there's a whole bunch more going on there, right? There's view sets that are which collection of records and with which data, and then there's how do we turn those records into data? How do we turn that data into bytes, right? So the default renderer that I've been using is JSON, right? So it's to turn the data into a JSON object, but there's other ones. In fact, I've been using, like, you can just turn it into HTML, like you can create an HTML template here, or you can, all of these other things, like, oh, like, what if I want YAML? What if I want my data to be represented as a YAML response, and I want to be able to create based on a YAML representation? Well, there's a thing for that. I can install it, I can add it in, and then work with that instead of JSON. Again, the authentication, there are permission things. Maybe I could have expressed some of these things as permission, permission methods or whatever. These frameworks are big, and as a new user to one of them, and again, this is honestly, it's equally true of, again, Play and Laravel and Django and everything else as just a backend framework, and it's true of these things as REST API frameworks. They're complex, and learning how to work with them is an investment, frankly. This is part of the reason, again, I think the number of frameworks I would like to learn this should be as low as possible. It's another reason I'm not super thrilled about the client-side frameworks. Like, I have to learn a server-side framework no matter what, because I need a database, I need object persistence, I need authorization checks to happen on the server. I don't need a client-side framework. Maybe I can get away without it. I would like a REST API, but maybe I can get away without it. It depends how big the project is, right? Again, if this was a 100 developer project, yeah, okay. Like, having all these things is probably easy, and you're going to have some developers on each one. If this is a 1-person startup, or this is a 4-person class project, there's a lot of frameworks to put in the mix and to learn and to figure out how they're going to interact with each other. Okay. Okay, I can leave that. I think that's enough of that. Honestly, the Django REST API docs do cause me anxiety, because I do find it very challenging to figure out what's going on in there. Okay, a little compare and contrast here. The other thing, and we did hear about GraphQL during the technology evaluation, thanks to the group that presented about it. Effectively, these are, like, in some ways competitors, right? So I can have a machine readable way to access and work with my data, or this other machine readable way to access and work with my data, and I'm going to call them APIs. Like, REST is very much HTTP. Like, we love HTTP, we're going to stay with it, we like everything about it, let's use it to its max. GraphQL is, we're going to invent this new thing, and it can ride on top of HTTP, but it doesn't have to. There's often just the GraphQL URL, and everything is a post request, which, as an HTTP geek, does make me a little uncomfortable, but I can get over it. The kind of query that you make in GraphQL is much more standardized, where, again, REST is effectively just a bunch of conventions about how you might set up a thing. GraphQL does have rules, right? Like, what kind of query you make, and what records you're interested in, what fields you need, what foreign keys you need followed. There's just a way to express those things that in a REST API, like, I don't like the straw man of, like, oh, in a REST API, you have to make separate queries for all of those things. No, you don't. Like, what you need is a REST API designed so that the data that you need is returned in the response. That's not trivial. It is much, like, GraphQL is much more flexible that way, but it obviously can be done in a REST API. I don't know which one's better. Realistically, they're both good. They have different strengths and different weaknesses. I don't think I can say anything more definitive than that. Again, just being an HTTP lover, it's the way my life goes. My whole life lives on top of HTTP. I kind of like REST, but I'm willing to admit that's a bias of mine. Do you need to create an API? Yes. I mean, not for the project in this course, but yeah, probably sites should have APIs. It means that like a phone app is possible, right? So a phone app is probably the most obvious consumer of an API. I could have a mobile website and not an API, but maybe I want an app and not a mobile website, and also a mobile website, because I get this flexibility from an API. So maybe I'm going to use my API from like Vue or Vue or React or Angular. So those are going to be API consumers. It's going to be the web browser, JavaScript in the web browser making those requests, or my mobile app making the same request, or somebody else's mobile app making those requests, right? So on my side, I have to enforce all of the rules, right? The who can see what and who can change what, like all those authorization, authentication rules. I'm going to enforce that on the back end as part of my API. So then anybody that wants to create an app should be able to use that. That's great. CORS restrictions aside, like some other website that can hit your data and make those requests and do something you didn't think of. Like that's really cool to be able to sort of offer your users and community. It's not free. Like, again, for the project in this course, you don't really need an API. Like if you're going to go front end framework, yeah, you probably need an API to feed your Vue code or whatever. But in general, yeah, APIs are really good. So I think that's probably a good spot to stop. Well, it is because it's the end of my slide deck. I think that's plenty for me to say today. Next week, I'll talk about a very small amount about client-side programming and mobile web, and probably call it a course at that point. See you next week.